Today we're going to be talking about segments and midpoints. We're going to start off with a quick review from yesterday. So please pause the video and attempt to do the matching problem that is numbers 1 through 8. The pictures are describing each of those vocabulary words. Technically, you should be able to answer each and every one of those based on yesterday's notes. I'm going to do a quick run through on your answers now that you've completed them on your own. A is a right angle, and I know that because of the little box that's drawn in the corner. B is a straight angle because although it looks like a line, they're referring to the angle that measures 180 degrees. C is a line segment, and I know that because that line segment has endpoints at both ends. And if I was going to name this line segment, the endpoints, let's say, could be called A and B, and I would write it like this with that line segment symbol over the top of it. They did not ask you to do that. I just thought I'd mention it. H is a ray. It has one endpoint and continues forever in one direction. The notation for that uses the ray symbol, and the endpoint, the one endpoint, always has to go first underneath there. So that's going to be a ray. J is going to be a line. I know that because it has arrows on both ends. When I name that line, I would name it with the two letters that sit on it with the line symbol over the top of it. So that's a line. An obtuse angle is an angle that's more than 90 degrees but less than 180. That's going to be choice L. An acute angle is an angle between 0 and 90 degrees. That's going to be I. And then a linear pair of angles are two angles that sit next to each other that form a straight line. That's going to be what we see over here in F. Together, when you put them next to each other, side by side, they form a straight line or a 180 degree angle. So that's going to be F. So like I said, these are the definitions you should know from the previous day. We're going to move on and talk a little bit more about line segments today, and we're going to talk about how we can add these segments together. So in the next section, you can see that we're talking about segment addition, and it's talking about a whole segment being split into two parts. So I'm going to draw a picture for that. So I have a segment that's split into two parts, not necessarily equal. So they're not saying two equal parts, they're just saying two parts. And the two parts added together are going to equal the whole segment. So they're essentially saying here that we have a segment that goes from A to C, and point B sits somewhere on that line. If A, B, and C are all collinear, what that means is they sit on a straight line. So I'm going to place B on the line, but I'm not going to put it smack dab in the middle because it's not telling me that it's the midpoint. So in this scenario, this is part 1. I'm going to label that P1, and this is part 2. P2, and if I add those two together, it's going to equal the whole entire segment. I'll give you an example. If AB is 5 and BC is 10, then to figure out the length of the whole thing, I would add the two of those together and get 15. So if I wanted to go back now and fill in the blank here, if A, B, and C are collinear and B is on line segment AC, then one of the things that I know is that part 1 plus part, whoops, I forgot the 1, hang on. Part 1 plus part 2 is going to equal the whole. Or if I wrote this in mathematical notation, I would say the part that goes from A to B plus the part that goes from B to C is going to equal the whole thing that goes from A to C. It makes sense, but sometimes when we have mathematical notation in there, it seems a little bit more confusing. So in the question that's here, in number 1, they're telling us basically that they want us to use what we see over here. They want us to use this picture. So they're telling us in this section with a big star next to it that if we are told that A, B, and C are collinear and B is on the segment that goes from A to C, that you are to draw a line segment labeling the endpoints A and C and put point B somewhere on the line segment but not in the middle. So unless we're told it's in the middle, we don't want to put it there. So when I go to do question number 1, that's exactly what this wording says. So I want to draw the segment that goes from A to C, and I want to put point B somewhere on there. And in this case, they tell me that AB is 7 and BC is 15. And if they want me to find the whole thing from A to C, I know that what I'm going to do is add the two of those parts together. So part 1 plus part 2 equals the whole thing of 22. Let's move on to the next question. In the next question, it's the same scenario. We have 3 points that are collinear. But the thing that's different here is that they've changed the names of the points. Instead of A, B, and C, it's D, E, and F, but they're still collinear. My segment goes from D to F, and E is somewhere in between D and F. And if they are not telling me that it's the midpoint, I do not want to put it in the center. I want to put it off center. So there's my picture. They tell me DE is 8. They tell me DF is 30. Be careful when you mark this. DF is the whole entire thing. And they're asking me to find the EF part. So this is the part that they want me to find. So one of the things that I could do is I could say that 8 plus however far it is from E to F, what we have labeled with the question mark, is 30. And I could minus 8 from both sides and find out that EF is 22. So that's a little bit more of an algebraic way to do this. Some of you may say, well, I don't think I have to set up that equation. Can't I just say if the whole thing is 30 and one part is 8, then the other part must be 22. So this is the whole. Here's part 1. Here's part 2 that's left over. When we get into question 3 can look a little bit more challenging because what you're going to notice in question 3 is that now they've made it more of an algebraic type of problem. So we just need to be a little bit more careful. Our 3 points are collinear. K sits on JL. So in this case, when I draw my picture, here's JL, K sits somewhere on there. I want to go back and label everything. The part that goes from J to K, I'm going to label with an X. The part that goes from J to L is 11. And the part that goes from K to L is X plus 1. We're going to use the same idea here, that if I want to take the two parts and add them together, part 1 plus part 2, they would be equal to the whole thing, 11. So essentially part 1, which is x, plus part 2, which is x plus 1, has to equal 11. So I'm using part 1 plus part 2 equals the whole, if that helps anybody. And then I go through and solve the equation. So 2x plus 1 equals 11. So 2x is equal to 10. And our x value then is going to be equal to 5. The next section changes a little bit what it is that we've been doing. And in this situation, what we're talking about now, they're actually telling us that we will have a midpoint. And if a segment has a midpoint, then the two parts are going to be equal. Notice the change in the wording here. They're saying B is the midpoint on the segment that goes from A to C. So when I draw my segment from A to C, B sits right in the middle, which means the part that's over here and the part that's over here, AB on the left and BC on the right, have to be equal to each other. So I'm going to put in here that if B is really the midpoint, then the part that goes from A to B is equal to the part that goes from B to C. And we also still know that the one part plus the other part has to equal the whole thing. One other thing that I would like to mention is that if we know that B is the midpoint, we know that one of the halves, let's say AB, has to be equal to half of the whole thing. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. If I was to tell you that the whole entire stretch from A to C was 20, and B is the middle, and I wanted you to find this part, you could basically take half of that 20. So half of the 20 and find out that it's 10. And it wouldn't matter which part you were looking for. Both of the two parts are going to be equal to each other. So they tell us here what we're drawing. If we're told B is the midpoint of AC, we're going to draw a line segment. We're going to label the endpoints with A and C, and we're going to put B in the middle of that line segment. So you can see they've drawn a picture over here for you. We're going to be drawing that same picture. So in question number 4, B is the midpoint on the segment that goes from A to C. So I'm going to draw a segment that goes from A to C. And my placement of B is going to be right in the middle so that these two parts are equal to each other. In this problem, they're telling me that AB is 15. And as soon as I know that one part is 15, I also know that the other part has to be 15 because they're equal. Excuse me. AC, which is the whole thing then, will be equal to 15 plus 15, which is going to give me 30. Of course, instead of doing 15 plus 15, you could also do 2 times 15, because if one part is 15, so is the other. On the next question, same wording, just going to be drawing a different picture because they have changed the letters. So I'm not changing the picture, I'm just changing the letters. F is the midpoint of EG. So I have a segment that goes from E to G, and my placement of F this time will be in the middle because they said the word midpoint, which means that these two parts are equal. EG is 28. Be careful where you put that. That's the whole entire thing. And if EG is 28, and the two parts that make it up have to be equal to each other, and I'm asked to find one of those parts, I can take the 28 and divide by 2. So FG, what it is that we're looking for, will be 1/2 of the 28, which we know is going to be 14. The two parts have to be equal to each other. In number 6, same scenario, K is the midpoint of JL. So I have a segment that goes from J to L, and K sits in the middle. JL, the whole thing, is 2x plus 6. And the question says find JK, that's this, in terms of x. So when they say in terms of x, that means that our answer will have an x in it. So one of the things that I know is JK has to be half of the whole segment. And for us, the whole segment is JL. So in here, I'm really doing half of 2x plus 6 because we know that JL is 2x plus 6. When I go through and distribute, I end up with 1/2 times 2x, which is x, and 1/2 times 6, which gives me 3. So this is my representation for JK in terms of x. Question 7. You'll notice the wording's the same again, so we're doing the exact same thing. Q is the midpoint of PR. The only thing that changes here is that we are using the different letters and making Q be our midpoint this time. QR is 2x plus 6. And they want to know the representation for PR in terms of x. So one of the things that I know is PR is the whole thing, and if one part is 2x plus 6 and Q is the midpoint, then the other part must also be 2x plus 6. So PR is really 2x plus 6 plus 2x plus 6, which gives me 4x plus 12. Just as a little note, you could have also said that PR is 2 times the quantity 2x plus 6, and you could have distributed and gotten the same answer. So some of you may say you think that that's a little easier. Okay, question 8. We're moving along here. Same exact type of scenario. K is the midpoint of JL, so I'm going to draw my segment from J to L and place K right in the middle, so my two parts are equal. JK is 3x plus 2. KL, 6x minus 13. And they want me to solve for x. In this scenario, I have to pay very close attention to the fact that the two parts are equal to each other, which means 3x plus 2 is equal to 6x minus 13. The part that goes from J to K is equal to the part that goes from K to L. And then I do my solving from there. Notice we're not spending a lot of time on the algebra here. We assume that you are good at that algebra. We're more focused on you being able to set up the equation. We need to make sure that you know how to do this. The solving is really last year's math. In question number 9, it is talking about the same scenario. T is the midpoint of SU. The one thing we're going to change here, though, is the letters. So same scenario. T is in the middle. The part that goes from S to U is 5x plus 4. The part that goes from S to T, 2x plus 37. And they want us to solve for x. That word, midpoint, super important because what we know is the two parts are equal. That may not seem like a big deal, but please remember if one part is 2x plus 37, then the other part must be 2x plus 37, which means that I have two 2x plus 37s that will equal 5x plus 4. So basically here you have two parts, and when you add them together it equals the whole entire segment. So I'm most concerned about you being able to set this up. We also need to distribute. I'm going to minus the 4x from both sides, and I'm going to minus the 4 from both sides. So I get 70 is equal to x. So in this case, x is 70.